Prime Minister is Shadman.
Hmm.
Oh, अच्छा. Prime Minister is Shadman. DPM is Zaid.
Hmm.
Wasif government whip.
Okay. From Opp?
I initially made a mistake. Shodip bhai. Warish के PM दिए दिए भूले.
Acha, Varish is doing what? Varish is not speaking, is it?
He's not speaking. Shadman is PM.
Shadman is PM. Okay. On opposition, it is Supriya, leader of opposition, Elakiya, deputy leader of opposition, and Shubhankar, opposition whip.
Okay. And the motion is.
Basically, there are different things also. So, yeah, I have to share in a bit.
The motion is this House believes that the West should reintroduce sanctions on Myanmar due to persecution on Rohingyas. Right?
Wasif Shadman. Adil bhai, আমি একটু টাকা দেই। কি রে কি হলো কি ফিস্ট করতেছিস? হ্যাঁ। বাহ তোর ওই আমার কিছু পায়। তখন কাছে রেকর্ডটা ছিল। For the first time, this will happen on this people.
Guys, are you ready? Asif?
Yeah, we're ready. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Are you using the camera or not?
We will be using the camera.
Okay, okay.
Okay. Right.
Okay, Adil bhai, over to you.
So the judges will be Bishal and Adil bhai, right?
Okay. Works for me. So, welcome to another practice session between Debate India and Team Bangladesh. In this debate, we have Team Bangladesh as government with Shadman as PM, Zayed as DPM, Wasif as government whip. We have Debate India as opposition with Supriya as LO, Elakiya as DLO, and Shubhankar as Opp whip. With the motion that this House believes that the West should reintroduce sanctions on Myanmar due to the persecution of the Rohingyas, I invite the Prime Minister to present the positives. Here.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll just take 30 seconds. Alright. Cool. What's it? Yeah, the timer will sit down. Guys, ready? Okay. Evil persists due to inaction of others. In this debate, Team Bangladesh will first tell you how exactly we are going to do, how exactly we are going to implement this model that we have at hand. Secondly, we will talk about the condition that we have in Myanmar at this point in time. And finally, we will tell you why sanctions are specifically the method that is going to work and why exactly we need this at this point in time from the Western nations. Let's start the speech by talking about what essentially is happening in Myanmar and how our model is going to solve that. Currently in Myanmar, we have a unique situation. It is not that everyone doesn't know what exactly is happening in Myanmar, but in most cases, the administration actively denying what is happening in Myanmar at this point in time. That means if you ask them, they would not accept what is happening inside their country. Secondly, they aren't very much enthusiastic about condemning the killing of Rohingya community at this point in time. What we as side proposition are willing to do is make sure that we have large sanctions on Myanmar government until they provide relief and stop oppression of the Rohingya community at this point in time. How do we make sure that we make a transition towards more liberal relations? We make sure that we make this transition by observing whether they change their behavior, and as they change their behavior, we're willing to take positive steps that reinstate the positive relations that we have with Myanmar. But until that happens, we don't think we're willing to take off the sanctions at this point in time. In conclusion, that clearly shows why it goes with the problem that we have in Myanmar at this point in time. Why essentially is this important? Let's understand this by, in my speech, I will give you two arguments as to how we make sure there's a political change that is initiated in Myanmar, and secondly, why this is specifically the only thing that can be done in context of Myanmar at this point in time. My second speaker will come up and talk about the consequences and the impacts on people's life and how in long term we make sure there's a positive change in the people of Myanmar. Let's move on to the first set of ideas that I'm going to talk about. But before that, I will take a point of information. Moving on.
So tell
Okay, sorry.
So tell us how by the West will work when the West is such an inconsequential trade partner to Myanmar.
Okay, so first of all, it is not essentially true that West is an inconsequential trade partner, because provided most of the Western nation being dependent on the tertiary sector, the primary sector comes from Asian countries, and a large part of it, for example, leather and other industries, are mostly dependent on Western trade for Myanmar in most cases. Moving on to my first argument as how it essentially creates a political change and how a political change is initiated. Ladies and gentlemen, in modern capitalistic structures and democracy, law is no more a tool of regulation in itself. Law has become an expression of ideology of people. Why is this important? Because it only tends to protect people who run the economy and put the government in power at the cost of people who do not have much of an impact on the lives, on the economy, and on the government. Why is this important? Because currently, Buddhist leaders and extremists are the individuals who have the momentum on their side. That means, since like most other developing economies, the economy of Myanmar isn't at its peak, it is easy to pry on the vulnerabilities of people, and it's easy to pry on the vulnerabilities on the economies. Hence, since an unstable demographic is always going to scare a government, Buddhist monks and extremists are the ones who actively take up the mantle of scaring people and scaring the government at this point in time by taking advantage of the situation of the economy at this point in time. What is the conclusion of this idea? The conclusion of this idea is this. Since these people have the massive capability of mobilizing a large number of people, that means government is more willing to cater to the ideology of these people. That means linking back to my first principle idea that since law protects people in these places who are more likely to impact the government, in conclusion, it makes sure the government caters to the ideas and needs of this Buddhist extremists at this point in time. Hence, it is most beneficial for government to look away from the Rohingya killings. So why do we essentially fulfill our burden? Because this what the sanction essentially does, it brings the focus on people who now are newly capable of mobilizing in most cases. Who are these people? These are the people who are the most economically affected. It will be quite unnecessary to argue for opposition side and come up and say that Rohingyas are the people who will be disproportionately affected, which is not true. Because even when sanctions aren't existent, these people are mostly neglected. What is worse is the amount of money that they gain from trade is used for oppressing these people. In our model, we understand a marginal amount of harm may be inflicted upon the people of the lowest strata of the society. However, the benefits are far greater. How? Because currently, since the economically affected individuals, who are the majority in this case, have the greater ability to mobilize because they are the ones who can affect the economy in the biggest way, the looking away from the Rohingya issue becomes much more problematic for the government. Why does this happen? Because previously, when you looked away from this whole Rohingya killing as a Myanmar majority individual, you didn't have much to lose. And if you went ahead to protest, not many people will protest with you and come by your side because it's not that big of a harm that is being inflicted on their life. Right now, looking away has such a huge cost on their life. That means, in conclusion, when every other individual sees an economic instability, they always look forward to a society that has more peace. They always look forward to a society that can give them stability. In conclusion, it threatens the government and it tells them that their power is in threat because another party which promises political stability and empowers and doesn't look forward to kill this Rohingya majority and create political instability are the individuals who will be prioritized. In conclusion, we make sure it is too expensive to ignore. The final idea is why West is the only possible entity that can do it. Because understand this, ladies and gentlemen, with Middle East being politically vulnerable and Asia being economically unstable, despite recent changes in political landscape in US, due to having most check and balance systems and shared sense of foreign policy, West is still the most stable entity that is around. The conclusion of this idea is this, that actions of the West are the most trusted and relied by the whole world. That is why millions of people being killed in Syria or an attack in Turkey gets much less traction than a car bombing in European Union, because simply the world trusts them to be more stable in most cases. When these individuals not only put sanction on Myanmar, but reinstate one, which clearly shows that Myanmar was supposed to keep a promise, but they failed to keep a promise of political stability. It hurts the credibility of a nation that is trying to build itself and trying to build a foundation for themselves. In conclusion, individuals will be less willing to have relations with Myanmar because they don't want to be seen as a nation that sides with a country that kills people indiscriminately. We should win this debate. We have clearly shown to you why essentially we save the most vulnerable and we make sure that we make it expensive for the people and government look away from the problem. Thank you.
This house acknowledges Saadman's PM speech. Moving on towards the opposition side, I invite Supriya to give the LO speech.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, it's cool.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us all look at the problem we're dealing with today. We're dealing with the problem of thousands of men, women, and children displaced from their homes. Hundreds brutally murdered, tortured, kidnapped, raped, and assaulted. About 1 million Rohingyas are refugees of a genocide in their homeland, and even as we speak. And in such a dire condition, we, on side opposition, do not believe that sanctions from a distant West, which has no technical knowledge or idea as to how this conflict plays out, will provide any significant change in the matter at discussion. So what do we have to prove from side opposition in order to win this debate? We have to prove to you that these sanctions imposed by the West will simply not work and will have negative outcomes. What do they have to prove? They have to prove to you as to why sanctions is the best way to go, and secondly, as to why the West should be the only actor to impose this. So what do we propose on side opposition? What alternative do we give to these vulnerable Rohingyas, these Rohingyas who do not have any other means to protect themselves? We believe in stationing UN peacekeeping forces in the areas, especially in the Rakhine state, where Rohingyas are subjected to such great acts of violence. We believe that this stationing UN peacekeeping forces in this region will prevent this genocide from happening. We believe that, say, if UN peacekeeping forces had stepped up in a similar condition in Rwanda, things would have further improved. Right? We also propose humanitarian aid from our side. Once peace is restored and the current violent situation is stabilized, we will propagate humanitarian aid being reached to these to Myanmar and the Rohingyas. And thirdly, we believe in long-term reforms that are organically come from the Rohingyas. We believe that the only way to have long-lasting and sustainable reform is when the Rohingyas demand for it, and it is when the Myanmari people can support that kind of organic change, not when it is imposed by the West and, say, Myanmar just as a token would propose reforms on paper but not really follow up on that. And secondly, we believe that sanctions do not work. Take the case of North Korea. The West has almost all countries in the West have burdened North Korea with sanctions. Has that stopped Kim Jong-un from discriminating against his own people? No. Which is why we believe that a similar sanction policy on Myanmar will also not work. So I will be talking to you today about how this policy of the West imposing sanctions will not work. But before that, a few points of rebuttals. Now, team proposition here came and told as to how the West will propose large sanctions on Myanmar. So let us look at the effect that this has on Myanmar. They agree that Myanmar is a country that is in economic turmoil, but but a very careless assumption they make, and something we asked in a POI, is that how reliant is Myanmar on the West, to which they say they are because of the primary sector. We believe that's not the case. The major trading partners of Myanmar are the ASEAN countries, namely India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And when these countries still continue to trade with Myanmar, we believe that the Western sanctions does not have any effect and thus will not be able to bring about the quick, immediate reform that they want. And we believe that in this time in which they can bring about these reforms, there will be enough Rohingyas who have been persecuted against, enough Rohingyas murdered, tortured, and brutally assaulted. That is something we cannot handle on our side. And then the first speaker came up and drew an argument as to how this will ensure political change, that the majority will mobilize for the Rohingyas. If that was the case, why hasn't that happened now? And if they think that economic sanctions are the only reason this is going to happen, we believe that's not the case. Why? Because the West isn't a major trading partner, and the sanctions, for any sanctions of the West to actually have any impact, it is going to take a long while. And they believe that Rohingyas will not be affected by this because they're oppressed anyways. That's not how it works. They will be affected further just because they're oppressed, and this incentivizes the government to further deny the rights or facilities they provide the Rohingyas. And then they come and make an argument as to how the Middle East is vulnerable, Asia is unstable, and hence, just because the West is the only credible bloc in the global community, it is justified in imposing sanctions. We believe that that is not the case. The West has significantly jeopardized its credibility. Take the case of Middle East. The very reason it's such big of a turmoil is because of Western interests, and we believe that's not the case. So moving on to my first argument, before which I'll take a POI. Seeing none, okay.
Are you against the sanction that was imposed during apartheid? We
believe that the sanctions that were imposed during the apartheid was not the reason the apartheid ended, right? We had a revolutionary movement inside South Africa, inspired by leaders like Nelson Mandela. So we don't really know how much the sanctions actually contributed to resolving the entire issue, and we think South Africa would have been better off without it. So moving on to my argument as to how sanctions imposed by the West just simply do not work. Firstly, the West does not really understand much of this conflict. They don't understand the delicate internal issues. They're not directly affected by this. They don't face the refugees that the hundreds of refugees coming in through their borders. They do not know how the Myanmari government, the way, say, nearby countries know, and they don't actually gain anything out of this. They don't really know much about how the internal politics of Myanmar works, and even if they do, they're not the best actor to actually work on this. Secondly, we believe that there is a lack of Western incentive to impose sanctions, heavy sanctions, as Team Proposition puts it, on Myanmar. Why? Because, as I said before, this doesn't directly affect them. They're not facing the fallout of refugees. They're not facing the immediate impacts of this crisis. So thus, any action that comes from them is purely from a humanitarian standpoint, right? And secondly, we believe that the prevalence of Islamophobia within these countries, the rise of populism and the rise of anti-Islam policies will further make it harder for countries to impose sanctions to help the Rohingya Muslims due to the general hostility against the Muslim community. And thirdly, even if we believe that these sanctions will make a difference, it will not, because as I mentioned before, the US and the EU aren't large enough trading partners with Myanmar. So thus, there isn't much of a significant difference this can make. And any negative effects of this policy will directly affect the Rohingyas more than it can any others, like common people in Myanmar. And thirdly, even if we assume that there will be change, we believe that this is not quick. This is not fast enough to prevent the mass violence, the mass acts of persecution committed against the Rohingyas. But why are we different? We're different because UN peacekeeping forces are more likely to stabilize the conflict zone, right? They're more likely to get immediately contain this conflict, to propose a quicker change and to restore peace, the much needed short-term peace, effectively. And thus we protect the vulnerable interests of Rohingyas on our side, which is why our policy is better than any sanctions that the West can impose. Thus I'm very proud to oppose.
So this house acknowledges the leader of the opposition. Moving back to the government side, DPM Zaid.
Is it unmuted? Yeah. Thanks.
The crux of the opposition case was that USA and the West are not big trade partners with Myanmar, that there are other methods of dealing with these problems, but no analysis as to why those methods are exclusive. And finally, a blanket assertion that the West is not credible and no one will listen to them. I will tackle all three of these assertions and then move on to my main case of how exactly these sanctions will bring about change. First of all, they come in and tell you that the sanctions on North Korea didn't work, and that's why it won't work on Myanmar. We think that using the most extreme country in the world as an example for a general rule is very far-fetched. Secondly, North Korea is in a very unique situation in that they have absolutely no trade with the international community whatsoever. To them, a sanction does not matter. To Myanmar, it does matter. And here's why. They asserted that their main trade partners are India, Bangladesh, and other Asian countries. We tell you, to an extent, it's true. They have good trade relations with those countries. But the problem is, these countries are also focused on the primary sector and oftentimes produce the same goods that Myanmar tries to export into the international community. There is an understanding that the biggest importers in the world are the Western countries, where USA is number one, where London and New York are the hubs of economic mobility and trade. We tell you that Myanmar has huge access to these currently because they have something that the West doesn't, and they sell it in hordes. We tell you, when we stop and close that gate, they need to look for partners, and there aren't partners that they can rely on that they aren't already trading with. They are already trading with India, and they're trading with the West. When the West stops trading with them, they can't just ship over all the goods to India because India doesn't need them, Bangladesh doesn't need them, and if they were to go into trade deals with such power imbalances where Myanmar is the beggar, then they can make trade rules that will be vastly favorable for the Asian countries, and that's something Myanmar does not want. So the sanctions will have effects on Myanmar, and I'll go on to prove how these effects will bring about change. But before that, they come in and tell you that humanitarian aid is something that we're going to provide, and I think this is something that is not exclusive, and it's not different from the status quo because humanitarian aid is already provided. They're going to put in UN peacekeepers in these places. The problem with that is you need to come to a general understanding among all nations that this is a genocide. Given Myanmar does not even acknowledge that this is happening and that this is a problem, that's something is going to be difficult to do. Beyond that, we don't think it's exclusive. We think if you can come up with a method of bringing UN peacekeepers and directly stopping the killing of people, we think that's good, and we go for that as well on top of sanctions. Because just because there are UN peacekeepers stopping people from murdering and pillaging does not mean Myanmar people will stop trying. We tell you the only way they can stop trying is if there's a change in the laws and if there's an incentive for the government to start stopping this. Finally, they said, why must West be the only actor? We tell you, West doesn't have to be the only actor. We think that if there are allies of the West that would like to partake in this embargo of Myanmar, we're happily willing to include them. We tell you, West is the actor in this debate because West has a sort of understanding and sort of hegemony of values for humanitarian aid and against genocide that they all can get behind. That isn't present with the Middle East, that isn't present in Asia. We tell you that's why the West should go for this. So, and finally they said our method is too slow, but then their method relies on Rohingyas emancipating themselves with no political capital, with no economic capital, albeit they're being murdered and raped. We think their model is much, much slower. So moving on to the direct methods of how this works. First of all, understand that because they're a primary sector economy, a large part of their economy is labor intensive. That is to say, when you cut down the exports of that country, a lot of people will suffer for it. And we think this is a necessary evil because once these people suffer, once these people have a reason and an economic cost to not stopping the killing of Rohingyas, that's the only time they're going to take action against the Buddhist monks who control a lot of political power, who control a lot of ideological power, and who to support is something that's big for them. We tell you, when these people are hurt, since it's a fresh democracy that just came out of a military junta, there is an understanding that you can actually impact your nation. There's an understanding that your vote matters. right? There is no apathy. So when people feel like they're being harmed because of inaction of the state, they're going to take to the streets. They're going to tell their politicians to change these policies. They're going to tell these people to go and fix this problem and get back. That they are going to be affected because they have all the factories that are now going to be shut down because they have nobody to trade with. We tell you these people will have direct incentives to pressure the Myanmar government to change and stop their policies. Finally, even if these are claims that the Myanmar government doesn't want to listen to, we tell you that opposition parties at least will instrumentalize this and use it against them. They will tell you that we can be your saviors, we can get back your jobs, because if you vote us into power, we are going to stop these people from killing Rohingyas. We are going to stop these people, the West, from having sanctions on you, and you're going to get back your job. And there's going to be a political and directed effort to change these policies because of these opposition parties. And because of these three reasons, there is huge incentives for the Myanmar government to let go and start prosecuting these people. But before I move on, a POI.
Sir, considering that you haven't really established a timeline as to how the sanctions work, what do you think is the estimated, like how long do you think these sanctions will be in place?
These sanctions will take years. It's going to take years for these effects to come and start impacting these people. However, this is much faster than any other method of passive aggression, where you have UN peacekeepers there. Because even if you have UN peacekeepers there, as we've seen in Haiti, it doesn't stop crimes from happening. It doesn't stop the incentive for people to commit those crimes, especially because they're ideologically motivated. They don't care if they're caught per se. We tell you that this means you've got to have a long discussion in that nation, and you've got to have the government coming in and saying that this is not something you can do, and this is not something that's going to be accepted in this country anymore. And that can only happen if you give a reason for these governments to change. That doesn't happen simply because you have more policemen in those areas, because the government doesn't necessarily need to change. So what have we shown you? We've shown you that there are direct reasons for the government to change because of sanctions. We've told you that it is not like North Korea, and that Rohingyas cannot be trusted to give their own emancipation, given the terrible situation that the leader of opposition painted in the beginning of their speech to begin with. But one final point. They said that West is not credible and is not able to influence these discussions. We tell you that the examples they used was the Middle East. We tell you they become less credible the more they are inactive. When you have Muslims being killed in Myanmar simply for being Muslims, and there is no action from the West, there's an understanding that the West does not care. This hurts their relations and decreases their credibility even more. So even in the interest of the West, it is profitable for them to go in and try to fix these problems. And for those reasons, we think that the West needs to impose these sanctions with the same force that they did for South Africa a long time ago. Thank you very much.
This house acknowledges the DPM. Moving back to the opposition side, I invite Elakiya to give her DLO speech.
Just 1 second. Okay, I'll be start. 1 second. There are thousands of lives at stake. When people are being tortured, murdered, and raped every minute, we tell you that the right thing to do is take the course of action that quickly and effectively saves lives, right? We don't take the course of action that, as a proposition themselves have admitted, takes years and a whole bunch of structural changes to even start working. We think that people's lives are not things that you throw away like that. We think that you step in and you save these people as quickly as you can. We think we're the side that does it. We've already told you why. We'll tell you why one more time for the benefit of the proposition, right? So proposition came out here and told us that they need to tell us that sanctions work, right? And we tell you that over the course of 2 speeches, they've done nothing of the sort. We've asked them repeatedly why these sanctions by the West will work when the West is not a significant trading partner. And they gave us some vague ideas about how the Myanmar's primary sector is what the West is interested in and whatnot. And we tell you that that's not essentially true, right? We tell you that this is a fact panel that Myanmar's biggest trading partners are the Asian countries, are the countries that are the neighbors of Myanmar, and that the West plays a very, very little part, right? And we think that the point of sanctions is that they have a crippling effect on a country's economy, that they make people radically rethink the way their country is going because they are suffering, because they no longer have the economical stability that they need to survive, right? And we think that that's not something that they're going to achieve on their side, simply because the West and its trade policies don't have that much of an effect on Myanmar. We think that's a hugely problematic issue in their case, because that means their sanctions don't work. And we'll tell you why this is so very problematic, right? We tell you that this is so very problematic because people are dying, right? Because people are being raped and people are being tortured for no fault of their own. And we think that you should take the kind of measures that work, the kind of measures that bring about change, and the kind of measures that save these people, and not measures that don't work. We think that's hugely problematic on their side. They need to tell us why and actually give us concrete reasons why these sanctions work. They haven't done so as of now. They also came up and put before us an assertion that once these sanctions are put in place, they're going to cause political change within the country, because now there's going to be opposition parties that say, oh, we'll stop these sanctions, vote for us. We think that's ridiculous. We've already told you that these sanctions don't work. Now let's take the case that these sanctions do work, right? We think that they failed to understand what Myanmar is as a state right now. It's a fledgling democracy. It's a democracy whose parliament is still hugely controlled by a military junta that's been supporting this kind of oppression, this kind of torture and these kinds of killings for years, right? And we think that this doesn't work. We've also asked them before why they think these sanctions are going to work in this situation specifically, right? There were already sanctions imposed on Myanmar in the past when the military junta was in power, and these sanctions were by the West. It still took years and years, in addition to which there was a revolution within the country, after which there was some sort of change that occurred, and now Myanmar has elections, right? We think years and years are not the kind of time that we have to spare when people are dying. And we also think there's not enough political capital within Myanmar for that kind of change to happen. And we tell you that when you implement a policy that doesn't actually work, you're not going to achieve that political capital either on their side. As a result of which, that's another reason why their policy doesn't work. We still think that's hugely problematic, right? They also came up and told us that the reason why it's got to be the West is because the West is credible. We live in the age where the United States president is a climate change denier, right? We live in an age where people all around the world know that the West and its allies and undertake interventions solely for their own good. And we live in a time and age where the credibility of the West has never been lower, where the West is so untrusted that there are millions of countries who are very opposed to it. There are several countries that are very opposed to it. And we think that in this case, the West is not a trusted actor to impose these sanctions. And we also ask you, why is it that the actor has got to be trusted? Why is this so important? They didn't explain this to us. Their only rebuttal to my LO's questions on this point were that there is not enough political capital to stop this kind of human rights violation in the Middle East, and there's not enough political capital in Asia, as a result of which the West has to do it. We'd like to ask them to please stop characterizing it that way. We think that the countries in Asia and the people in Asia are the people who are going to actually care about this, because they're the people who have taken these Rohingya refugees, right? They're the people who are closer to the situation. They're the people who understand that situation. We think that even if sanctions were the only way to solve this problem, which they are definitely not, they shouldn't be imposed by the West, and that's another issue in their case which they have not addressed. I told you why a military intervention is way better, right? So let's look at the comparative on this. What we propose is a quick solution, the solution that saves lives. What they propose, by their own admission here, panel, is a solution that takes years and years and may or may not work based on the changes in political scenario that happen in Myanmar. We think that's hugely problematic when lives are at stake. We've already told you why. What happens on our side, right? When you put peacekeeping troops in this place, you stop a genocide. You make it easier for humanitarian aid to come in. And they told us that this is not mutually exclusive on their side. We'd like to point out to you that the Myanmar government is currently blocking access to humanitarian aid and humanitarian aid groups and NGOs in the status quo. We think that's the kind of thing that we change. We think that we provide food to thousands of Rohingya people who are starving because they're not protected by the state within which they live. We think that we prevent thousands of these Rohingya people from being murdered, from being tortured, and from being raped, and from being put in these tiny concentration camps where they're made to living conditions that are subpar with terrible sanitation. We think those are the kinds of things that we change when we put people on the ground who want to stop this and who want to help the Rohingya people, who want to stop this kind of human rights violation, who want to make it possible for humanitarian aid and other aid to come in from other countries which are willing to offer it. And we think those are the kind of concrete changes that we propose on our side. And we think that that's the kind of policy that will help these people. So what does proposition still have to tell us after two uneventful speeches, right? They have to tell us once more why sanctions work, because as far as we can see, they definitely do not. They have to tell us why, even in the case that sanctions are the right way to go, why it's the West, because we've already told you that the West is not as trustworthy as proposition would like to paint them, and they're not as concerned about the Rohingya Muslims as proposition would like to claim. This is not a conflict that's been going on for 2 days or 3 days. It's been a conflict that's been going on for decades. It's a structural issue, and we think for these reasons, we definitely already win this debate. We are very, very proud to oppose.
For the last constructive speech from the government side, I invite Wasif.
Guys, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes.
All right. In a world where the inaction of the people is the major cause of a lot of dislodging and the loss of several lives, we think that at least some action to change that apathy of these individuals is the most prudent way to change the problem that we have at hand. We think in Myanmar that is the founding problem, that people, despite not everyone has the intention to actively harm the individuals, the Rohingyas, but They are apathetic to an extent that does not prevent the killing of Rohingyas. From side proposition, from the first two speakers, they've clearly shown to you how we actively change this incentive of individuals to remain apathetic and inactive and actually become mobilized to some extent. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that was the founding argument of our case, and with very little rebuttal to this, we don't think they've shown a way in which there can be enough change to the government to change their stances on killing Rohingyas. In this debate, I'll answer two questions to win the debate. First, and this is the only thing that throughout the debate the opposition has argued on: will sanctions work? And secondly, I'll be discussing whether there are any alternatives and why they're less likely to be effective. And additionally, I'll also argue as to what happens when we do allow sanctions to be placed and what kind of changes that leads to. The first, on will sanctions work? The first thing you need to keep in mind when judging this question is that they have not been able to show us any direct harm of this sanction, as opposed to claiming that there might be some economic harms on the Rohingyas in specific. First, we think we already tackled this issue by showing you why, even in the existing economic structure within Myanmar, the Rohingyas are not recipients of the major economic resources. Therefore, even if trade flourishes, they're not going to get massively benefited. On the contrary, we think, ladies and gentlemen, even if we cut off this trade, they are not going to be the ones who are hurt the most. However, this allows them to have a hope of protection in the future, safety, having a stable home. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, for the Rohingyas, that is a significantly better future to look forward to, as opposed to one where you need to constantly have your life at threat for getting very little amount of the resources that are obtained through trade. But moving into the few areas which proves why these will work. Their problems with our case was that the West might not be credible. However, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that despite things like USA having Donald Trump as their president, they cannot completely go astray, because the West in particular, the countries which are so powerful, have a large number of obligations all over the world for which they need to maintain a certain standard of diplomacy, regardless of their internal problems. We think that there are more check and balances within these countries than any other countries that you could have had. And we believe that they can at least pull off the function of providing sanctions properly. And they also mentioned you need some kind of technical expertise in providing this, which they did not analyze and therefore is not really seeming like a real problem at this point. We believe that if alternatives are worse, because their alternative is that Rohingyas will mobilize themselves and rise up to create change of the government with absolutely no analysis, but also recognize, along with this condition of Rohingyas, we think they themselves do not have resources, they do not have the goodwill of the people, money, and are constantly at threat of their lives. With all of this being true, we think it's extremely far-fetched for Side India to today claim that they will automatically change all of the stances of the government which kills them. Because they cannot prove any other alternatives, they need to show us why trying to go on with sanctions is so bad and what are the opportunity costs of the sanctions. The second area of this debate is trade. We think, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a burden to prove that the West is the primary trade partner for Myanmar, but a significant trade partner. We have shown to you why they are significant in the very first place, because of the type of trade that occurs between these two areas. Secondly, we have shown to you why trade with Asia will not remain as prominent in the long term, because they both develop in the same industry. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we also explain to you why the countries in Asia like India or like Bangladesh actually are better allies of the West and would not risk trade with the West by cooperating with Myanmar. So we think they might first of all join forces. If not, they would not risk the alliance with the West by opposing their stance and trading with Myanmar. Therein, ladies and gentlemen, when Myanmar is already weak and just slightly developing at this point, it's a large amount of pressure on them in terms of trade to change their policy. This is the only area in which there was debate from Team India on any significant level. However, they ignored the first two arguments from our side. We have shown to you why the problem in Myanmar is greatly ignored by individuals, because it has become normalized and people stopped caring. We have shown to you why West's involvement here creates extreme media attention towards these problems and leads to a greater reason for people to acknowledge that something is not right within the country. We think that's the first thing you need to recognize. Secondly, we give you examples of where sanctions have worked in the past. Their only rebuttal to that was not the reason why they changed their policy. Even if that's true, ladies and gentlemen, we think the sanctions are reasons why people can mobilize themselves and understand something is wrong with their government. Thirdly, we've shown you why the people in the top areas of the economy are affected greatly by these sanctions, and also they are the ones who run the economic policy with the policies within that country which harm the Rohingyas. In both these levels, we show you a deterrent factor which reduces the amount of policy that harms these Rohingyas in the future. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we've shown you why opposition parties will take this chance and try to gain some kind of traction within these within Myanmar and change the rhetoric that exists and try to reduce and hence pressure the government to reduce the killing of Rohingyas. The only rebuttal to this was the capital does not exist, and that is it. We tell you that there is significant opposition, and like they claim themselves, there are people who oppose the killing of Rohingyas, thereby oppose the policy of the current party in power. In conclusion, there is a lot of pressure on 4 different levels. We have proven to you why sanctions are likely to work, and therefore we think that this question clearly goes to side proposition today, proving that sanctions are very effective. Any points of information?
Sir, what response do you have to the lack of incentives of the West for imposing sanctions?
We've shown you why. We've told you that the West is always the one who goes in to prevent these humanitarian crises. We've shown you that even in the past, whenever these problems arise, they're the first ones to act there. We've shown you that they have a responsibility and they usually act on it, because not acting on it means hurting their image on a very great level to the rest of the world as a failure to act when these countries who they trade with are not protected from these sorts of harms. Moving on to the next area of the debate, we think, ladies and gentlemen, by their own admission of alternatives, UN peacekeepers are not being able to conduct their actions of providing resources to Myanmar, which means that their policy and alternative does not work in the very first place. We think even if it does, this is not sufficient to change the government's policy and stance of killing Rohingyas. Therefore, you're only at best cushioning the blow, which will continue forever. They have not proven why Rohingyas can rise up to power and change anything. We have shown to you why there is a possibility of mobilization of people to change the policy under our world. And finally, we think, ladies and gentlemen, people who are apathetic, people who are politically influenced to not act for their own favor in status quo are hit economically the second you have these sanctions, and therefore they have a bigger reason to act. And finally, we think at this time, they're not going to direct all of their anger towards Rohingyas because the government is the one not changing policy. This leads to future sympathizing for the Rohingyas as well. In conclusion, we've shown you why the alternatives are not only can be incorporated into our model, but they're ineffective, and sanctions are very much the only way we can change the current problem. We're very proud to propose.
For the last opposition constructive speech, I invite Shubhankar.
Panel, when opposition says that it will save these people in years, that these economic sanctions will work effectively in a long term of years, then we would like to remind them that it is a genocide, and it is a genocide which has disastrous effects on these Rohingya Muslims. When these economic sanctions, even if they are effective, even when they will be able to claim the results of these economic sanctions, we think it would be far too late for these Rohingyas people who are right now in status quo suffering from a genocide by authoritarian Myanmar government. What am I going to show you today? Firstly, are there any alternatives? And secondly, why sanctions won't work. But firstly, are there any alternatives? Now, our opposition team came up and said, that peacekeeping forces and sanctions are not mutually exclusive. To which we say that this is not how things work, okay? There is a problem and there are different solutions to that problems. a solution is determined about how from the intensity of the problem. That is to say, if the problem if it is like a genocide, then it is a really serious problem. It is harming basic human rights of people. They are literally killing people. To which economic sanctions are used for crimes such as not serious crimes which come below genocide. And that is why we think that economic sanctions itself are considered for a different problem, whereas things such as UN intervention by peacekeeping forces is for serious problems like genocide. Secondly, they said that opposition will cooperate, to which we say that there is in status quo anti-West hysteria which has been thriving in around the world, in African countries, and it won't be late if the West very particularly directly poses sanctions on these Myanmari governments. That is to say that it will create an anti-West environment in Myanmar, which will then lead to opposition not going against the present government. Why? Because when you are directly harming a country's people, then we think that the country's government has direct interest and has so much interest to just directly say that these are the people who are doing it. We want to work for your good, but these are the people who are hurting you. We say that this anti-West hysteria will be developed in Myanmar, and that's why we think that opposition will not be able to cooperate in order to get rid of economic sanctions. Secondly and thirdly, they said that Myanmar doesn't recognize that this genocide is happening. To which we say not important at all. Why would Myanmar in first place recognize that there is a genocide happening? We think that UN has vested interest in saving people's lives and saving Rohingya community in particular, which has not been receiving so much limelight as other conflicts, and that is why we think that Myanmar not recognizing this genocide is not really a rebuttal. Now, what did we say to you? We said that UN peacekeeping forces intervention will work. We say that economic sanctions, yes, even if we say that economic sanctions will work, then too they take lots of years to show results. Panel recognize that there is a genocide happening, and its effects are disastrous. The short-term harms which are of economic sanctions are far bigger than the long-term benefits. We told you how this is too big of an issue to be solved with economic sanctions. We gave an example of North Korea, to which they said that yes, economic sanctions aren't working because North Korea doesn't have a trading partner. False. It has trading partner, and only one trading partner, that too, China. Now, if recognized panel that if North Korea is having just one trading partner, that is China, then see how much dependent they are on. China. That is to say that when these people, when the Myanmar government has economic sanctions on themselves, it won't work. Coming on to second class, we told you that economic sanctions alone cannot work. And they need other factors as well. In previous Myanmar government, when there was a dictator, why did he get off power? There were several reasons. One of them was economic sanctions, but majority and a major reason was because of people wanting to have a democratic government. Same goes in South Africa. Panel, economic sanctions are too trivial of an issue to be regarded as a solution to genocide. We think we need a far big solution, a far effective and quick solution than economic sanctions. They said on a POI we asked about West having no interest. They said that yes, but they depend upon South Asian nations. They do not really depend on Myanmar, and even if they did, then they haven't told us why it has not happened in status quo. That is to say, if they think that economic sanctions are too easy to pose, and if they think that West has an interest to pose them, then they haven't told us why. They haven't told us why it hasn't happened in status quo itself. Secondly, they said that they'll be post economic sanctions without really telling us how these economic sanctions will work, how these targeted, what will these economic sanctions target. Also, they didn't give us any example regarding a situation in which economic sanctions has saved people from a genocide. We think that's against their case. Then and then they said that attacks by West are considered credible. This is something that has been said by all three speakers. They say that West has credibility. As I've already counted it previously, how it will create anti-West hysteria, and then again, West does not really hold much credibility, and West has incentives to not thrive these anti-West hysteria. That is to say that the Western countries would not attack or would not attack by economic sanctions on these countries, because they do not want to be seen. They do not want to be seen as villains here. They do not want to be seen as bad guys here, as it is already happening in status quo. Before I move on and take up UI. Continuing.
Okay.
Say.
Sanctions directly stop trade, which is the quickest form of action without violating sovereignty. With peacekeepers in the short term, we want to start a war.
No, of course not. Like, what country would be so stupid to attack UN forces? It has happened previously. It has happened previously in the world that when UN forces are being attacked, then the West coalition will enter, because they have interest in this, because UN forces have been attacked. That is to say that Myanmar's government is not so particularly does not particularly have that much weapons. And secondly, these Myanmar countries would not. These Myanmar countries would not like to have a war against all the Western coalition and United Nations. They would simply not attack the UN peacekeeping forces, because as it has happened previously, there are far too dangerous consequences for that. For all these reasons, we are so proud to oppose.
Now for the opposition reply speech, I invite the opposition reply.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Panel, today we're here discussing about the persecution faced by Rohingyas, the endless acts of violence, of murder, of rape, and of injustice that they face. We are here to find the most sustainable and the most easiest short-term effective solution there is. And that is what we provide on side opposition. So let us analyze this debate in three main issues. Firstly, do sanctions work? Now, Team Proposition has made a concession by saying that sanction takes years to work, and that after a few years, after say 4 or 5 years, there is a chance that the majority will mobilize, and there is a chance that the opposition party will take this up, and then and only then will the Rohingyas be emancipated, and only then can the Rohingyas be free of this genocide. And this is something that we have constantly attacked on. We have constantly picked up on this right from the leader of opposition and told you that this is not the solution Rohingyas need. They need an immediate solution, an immediate recovery, and immediate relief from the violence they're facing, something that sanctions do not solve, which is why they lose. And secondly, they came up and gave examples of apartheid South Africa and the previous sanctions placed on the junta dictatorship in Myanmar, after which we pointed out that there are multiple factors contributing to those, and that it is very unclear as to how much the sanctions contribute to it, to which we received no response. They continued to harp on about how our model is not mutually exclusive and that they can claim all the benefits we do as well. But at the point at which we don't even know if sanctions work, they haven't really clarified as to what effect that will bring upon the current situation, we can just as well assume that our policy is more effective and more likely to work minus the sanctions than their policy with the sanctions, with the costs that they're bringing on the Myanmarese public and the countries that impose sanctions. And we have received no response to this. They have, as pointed out by my third speaker, they haven't really given examples as to how sanctions have prevented genocides or can prevent genocides or can actually provide an immediate solution to the genocide we're currently facing in Myanmar, which is why we believe that we have won this clash decisively. Secondly, which side better protects the Rohingyas? We believe that we are the side that proposes immediate change. We are the side that is that will provide immediate relief from violence to the Rohingyas and also facilitate a rather organic change within the Myanmar country rather than, say, West imposed sanctions that might lead to certain reforms that might not actually translate into paper. This is something, an analysis that came in the leader of opposition. They haven't really responded to it, and their policy of international pressure and pressure of sanctions is, they have not really told us as to how that will actually solve this problem. And 5 years is not, this problem is not something that can be sustained for 5 years. This is not something we can let happen on our side. And thirdly, as to whether the West is the best actor to this, they have told you the reason why the West is the most eligible actor is because of their credibility. While we've clearly pointed out to you the lack of incentives, the prevalence of Islamophobia, the very fact that they're not clearly directly affected by this. We've also told you that the West is not the most major trading partner, which is a fact which they have disproved continuously, and we have received no clear response on that, which is why we decisively win on this as well. And thus we believe that our side is the only side that provides the safe haven for Rohingyas, that prevents the act of persecution that they're facing in status quo effectively. Thank you.
For the last speech of the debate, I invite the government reply.
Time. So the main issues of this debate need to be refocused on. First, the debate is about whether or not the West should impose sanctions, not whether it's the only thing the West will do. So with that in mind, all of the opposition's questions as to why the West and not Asian or other Asian countries are not going to have sanctions are immaterial. Because if they're willing to have sanctions as well, we're fine with that. But we think that the West should as well. Similarly, all the alternative models are just supplementary models. If they can coordinate the UN to put peacekeepers there, we'd be happy to allow for peacekeepers to go there. But we still think that the sanctions need to be there, because increased police force, increased peacekeepers will not convince the Myanmar government to start prosecuting extremist Buddhist monks. It'll just maybe stop some of the killings that these Buddhist monks are carrying out. So what were the burdens in this debate? Our burden was to prove that the sanction helps create a better world for these Rohingyas and has even a marginal benefit to their lives. For them to win, they had to prove that these sanctions do more harm than good. And there has been a huge lack in the exclusive harms that these sanctions bring about. So the main question is this in this debate: is Myanmar going to care about the sanctions imposed of them? We showed you structural reasons why the economies of the West are suited to complement the economy inside Myanmar, where the Myanmar has a huge incentive to trade with the West. And that's why the West is a significant, if not the biggest, at least significant partner in trade relations with Myanmar. What they said in response was, Asian countries are big partners, but with no explanation or any analysis as to why the West is not significant, beyond the assertion that the West is not significant. We've shown you structural reasons why, if this sanction is going to be significant, as we explained it will be, we've shown you structural reasons why it will cause change within the people and will cause reasons and create pressure on the Myanmar government to start changing their policies regarding these killings. What they said in response was only one thing, that there is not enough opposition political capital for there to be any reason for them to start pushing the government. We tell you this was a blanket assertion. We tell you that this is not a military junta anymore. It is a working democracy that handed over, the military junta handed over their power to Aung San Suu Kyi after a democratic election. We tell you democratic elections are working fine. There's a huge amount of voter enfranchisement in that country because they believe that their vote and their voices have an impact. We tell you, if you hurt them and they feel like they want their jobs back, they're going to demand from the government, the rich people are going to demand from the government, and the opposition party is going to instrumentalize this. We've given you examples, contrary to the claims of the opposition, of where sanctions work. We've shown you previous sanctions on Myanmar have worked. We've shown you sanctions on apartheid have worked. They've come and muddled the debate and said maybe it wasn't just the sanctions that worked, but the sanctions helped. And that is the point of this debate. As long as the sanctions help, given that we do believe it is a genocide, given it is imperative that we do anything we can to help these people, if the sanction helps, the sanction should be carried out, because there are no harms, exclusive harms, that this sanction can bring about. What was their model of bringing about change? They said that they're going to put in UN peacekeepers, something that we're not against, mind you, but they're going to put in US peacekeepers to stop the killings, and they're going to make sure that the Rohingyas are the ones who demand their own emancipation, that they demand their own freedom. We tell you, Rohingyas, given the very scenario that the opposition so beautifully painted for us, where they're raped and killed and not cared about by the citizens of Myanmar, we find it very difficult to believe that these Rohingyas will have any ability to change the Myanmar government's policies. And if they were to criticize us for taking a long time to bring about peace, that model of Rohingya empowerment is going to take much, much longer. And for that reason, we think we win this debate. Thank you.
I thank everyone for that debate, and that concludes the debate between Debate India and Team Bangladesh. I thank the audience for watching so far.